Hello and welcome to Direct Initiative, the podcast where we talk about direct democracy and the importance of ballot measures. I'm Alex Kawa, and today I wanted to ask why certain voters might vote for ballot measures that might not align with the policies of the candidates they vote for. So specifically talking about why sometimes in many red states, we see liberal-aligned ballot measures such as the minimum wage and Medicaid expansion passing, even though those people who vote for that end up voting for Republicans in elections. And this comes off the heels of the latest election in Ohio, which we talked about a lot on this show. Issue 1, which was designed as essentially a power grab by the Ohio GOP. It would have raised the threshold to pass a constitutional amendment from a simple majority, 50% plus 1, to 60%. And this was directly designed to stop an abortion measure to put abortion rights in the Ohio Constitution. It was designed specifically to stop that from passing in November. And thankfully, it failed. And it failed pretty bad. It failed by 14 points, which for a red state like Ohio, that's a pretty big rebuke of the GOP there. And even in counties that typically vote red in elections, this measure was rejected. And it really just goes to show that even GOP voters are not aligned with what the GOP politicians believe. But I think this reignited a bit of a question that I've had for a while now. I'm sure many people have questioned, why are Republican voters in red states more likely to support Democratic or liberal, nominally speaking, ballot measures, even though they're still going to vote for Republican candidates? Well, 538 did an article about this a while ago. This was last year after Kansas, in a similarly timed August special election, voted down a proposed constitutional amendment to remove the right to an abortion from their state constitution. Quote, political scientists at the University of Arkansas and Hendrix College found in a 2019 paper that only about 24 to 30% of voters could identify a single ballot initiative before going to the polls in 2 election years in Arkansas, 2014 and 2016. There's some breakthrough with morals issues, the things that folks have an opinion on, but that's kind of the exception rather than the rule. The paper argued that the many ways political scientists have tried to measure what voters know about ballot initiatives before they go to the polls actually overestimates voter knowledge. This means the ballot initiative might not always deliver on its promises of a more engaged and informed electorate, especially if voters are asked to make too many complicated decisions they don't have time to research. And this is a fair point, because in the past I've said that voters, knowing that certain initiatives are on the ballot, would be more likely to turn them out to the polls. And maybe I'm guilty of overestimating that, but as the article states, if there's too many issues on the ballot, it might oversaturate things. And that's exactly what's happening in California, where they vote on some of the most, honestly, kind of benign issues that might not even need to be voted on. And it overwhelms the voter, and it gives them too much to think about when they go to the polls. Now, having an informed electorate is good, and having voters do their own research on certain amendments and initiatives and measures is good, undoubtedly. But when it starts to become a little bit overkill is when people can tune out. And that's why it's good that California is kind of an anomaly in the sense that most other states don't have that many ballot measures in a single election, which makes it a lot easier for the voter. But even then, most of the time, though, it doesn't matter that voters are steeped in the details of ballot initiatives. In fact, it might actually be a good thing, as it means voters aren't relying on partisanship heuristics and other clues to make their choices. Instead, the first time many voters learn about the ballot initiatives is when they see them in the voting booth and they make their decision then. The fact that ballot initiatives are often separated from politics might make these measures easier for some voters to support too. People identify with a party for many more reasons than one issue alone, and so they're not going to change their party affiliation or vote over something like a ballot measure. Because voters often don't know about ballot initiatives before voting, they're also not usually comparing them to candidate stances on those issues either. Now, this can also be a little bit concerning because these voters might still vote for these candidates who are against these ballot measures because these legislatures who they're voting for generally try to be coy about their positions on the issues as to, not piss off their electorate. But I think this is really important in understanding this question, like why do Republicans support nominally liberal policies when it comes put to a direct vote, but then they support conservative Republican politicians? And I think it also, again, it goes to their view of the parties. In, I think, a lot of the rural areas, which are overwhelmingly generally conservative, have been voting Republican because they feel left behind. They feel like the Democrat has become the party of coastal elites. and they feel that they've lost touch with their economic issues that they're facing. And that's why they're a lot more likely to support ballot measures that explicitly help the working class. Like, again, raising the minimum wage, expanding healthcare, stuff like that. So they know their own economic interests. And while it's fair to say that they know what's best for them, obviously this isn't always the case, because there are plenty of working class folks who voted for Trump in 2016 believing he was going to stick it to the establishment and was going to make life better for the working class, when obviously that didn't happen. He made it his biggest legislative accomplishment was a tax cut that over 80% of the benefits went to the top 1%, at least in terms of the permanent ones. The middle class tax cuts were temporary and probably not going to renew them, honestly. So while they know what their struggle is, they might be misguided in determining what's best for them. But when they see issues on the ballot that are, again, meant to alleviate their standard of living, even just somewhat, like raising the minimum wage and Medicaid expansion, I don't keep reiterating that, but it's important to drive home. They vote yes on that, regardless of whether they're a Republican or not, even though Republicans generally oppose stuff like that, because they know the situation they're in, and they're willing to do what they can to help things get a little bit better for themselves. But moreover, I think it's also a cultural thing, because of how they're raised and maybe where they grew up. These people are more likely to side with Republicans on cultural issues, and so on economic issues, and even some social issues like abortion. They might agree that the Republican positions are far too extreme, but given how they're raised, it's kind of in their blood, and so they're not ready to vote for a Democrat in that sense, but they are willing to support policies that Democrats nominally support. So is there really any takeaway from all this? I think it really just goes to show why in red states, more ballot measures are needed, and that's actually is possible because it's actually more red states than blue states that have a ballot initiative process. And it shows how you can actually bring people into your coalition who you might never have done before. For instance, in Michigan, which is a pretty swing to lean blue state, I would say, rural counties are going to go red, but you can talk to people in that and you can actually bring them in to support policies that would help their economic standard of living, such as raising the minimum wage, for instance, because that'll give you an opportunity to talk to them when otherwise you would write them off because they're not going to vote for a Democrat in an election. And that kind of coalition building can really bring class solidarity that can really strengthen a focus on economic issues that can be brought to the ballot box and can pass with large support. And who's to say that's a bad thing? But I also think what it shows is people are not monolithic. Just because they are Republican or they vote Republican doesn't mean they're going to agree with them on everything. And generally it shows that their natural inclination is good, because even in red states, again, nominally liberal ballot measures have passed, stuff that measurably improves people's lives, giving them high wages, giving them more healthcare. I keep reiterating this, but these have been some of the most common. Or increasing their freedoms by guaranteeing the right to an abortion, or guaranteeing the right to smoke weed if you really want to. Stuff like that. And in some cases, even increasing union power. For instance, in Missouri several years ago, there was a referendum that was getting on the ballot to overturn the legislature's decision to pass right-to-work laws, which really dramatically weakened the power of unions. So by focusing on ballot measures, you are able to, once again, not only coalition build with people you might otherwise have written off, but you'd also be able to bring new people into the process, people who otherwise might not have been inclined to get out and vote for a certain thing. But I also think this presents a major opportunity for ballot initiative campaigns to do certain voter education, and that can lead to bad things. Like as we saw with Protect Women Ohio in the last episode, they're just a blatant propaganda campaign, and thankfully they failed. Well, this was part one. Part two is we'll see if they fail in November, but it's looking likely that they will. So there needs to be outreach campaigns to people like this who are disaffected, who generally don't vote Democratic, but might support a liberal policy in terms of like economic agenda, or even in some cases a social agenda. So that's what needs to be done. And I think what we're seeing here, in not only in Ohio, but in several states across the country, and plenty of the examples that I've given throughout the course of the show so far, there is definitely potential for that. And there is potential for that to make a real difference in terms of policy in a certain state where everybody benefits, Democrat, Republican, whatever. And I think that's something that we're going to see more of, and we are seeing more of, and I really hope that with several red states. Just Ohio is just the latest in an attempt of several red states to weaken the power of direct democracy. This shows that people do not like their rights being taken away, and they're willing to fight for them, and they're willing to show up for them. And hopefully with these rights that they will be keeping now, because they've rejected this authoritarian power grab from the Ohio GOP, they use this to build on it and actually build a new movement of, once again, class solidarity, but also just more importantly, human versus human. Like, regardless of your differences, you might find that you have more in common if you just ask them about this issue, and who knows what that could lead to. So thank you all very much for listening to this. If you enjoyed and you're listening on YouTube, once again, as always, please like and subscribe down below. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, make sure you follow the podcast, leave a good review. Thank you all very much for listening. I'm Alex Kawa, and this is Direct Initiative.